Well, by dad, we have now reached almost the final talk for today, for Tuesday in Biofarm 2021. And Sean McGlone has been so excited about the next speaker both yesterday and today that I daren't introduce this man. Sean, it's over to you.
Thanks, Roncan. It's funny, you know, this is the most difficult slot to put in because it's one of those things. Agroforestry could have slotted yesterday, tomorrow, Thursday, Friday. So we finally settled on this day. And part of it is to do with the fact that we had one slot available that I thought would suit the previous speakers quite well. But it's funny, before we move on, I'm just wondering, does anybody know what this is? This is actually an old VHS tape. And what when you see this video, you'll understand why. Jim produced a video when he planted this originally, Jim?
That was done in 1997, about 6 years after we planted the trial.
Yeah, and now we went back this year to look at this, and this is what actually blew me away for a person I felt that I was up to speed in agroforestry. I thought was amazing when you're actually in that wood, and it's something we're going to have to do down the line. So away we go. Okay, you're very welcome to Loughall. This is 24 years on from Jim McAdam's original video on agroforestry. And I just sincerely hope that the trees have aged as well as you have, Jim. We're standing in the same spot.
Thank you very much, Sean. That's a compliment. It's good we're still standing here after 24 years. It is a real pleasure to be making this film again. That, you know, in those days that we set the trial up with the reason, which I'll talk about. But when you start off on a piece of research like that, you just never really know at the end of the day, how long is this going to last? And there are several times over those 24 years when I didn't think this trial would last because there was not a real interest in agroforestry. It could have all stopped at any time, but so here we are, 24 years later. The trees we'll see are 30, 31-year-old, and we've learned an awful lot from them, a lot of them that's really relevant to our thinking about agroforestry today. But if I could just go back to the start, if you like, in 1990, why did we set up this trial, the exact one we're on today? There was an interest throughout, particularly the UK anyway, amongst a group of scientists and people interested in land use and land ownership, in ways we could get more trees onto farms. Now, particularly in the north of Ireland, conventional forestry was really not working much. Farms were small. Average farm size then, I think, was 26, 27 hectares. And to get farmers to give up a hectare or 2 hectares of land for trees, it just wasn't working. Uptake of tree grants and so on was very poor. So we looked at alternative models, alternative ways to get trees onto farms. And one of those was a New Zealand model of silvopasture, as they called it, where you planted trees into wide space trees into grassland and then subsequently grazed that grassland, and so the trees and the livestock grew together and created what was essentially an agroforestry system. So we set about designing a trial that would be set up at 6 sites throughout the UK. There were 2 of those were in Northern Ireland, and one of them here at Loughall. And we ran that trial very successfully for about 12, 14 years. It was one of the biggest coordinated trials, if you like, across the Isles. And I mean, research is expensive, and to try and just do exactly the same thing on each site is difficult, but we managed to do that very successfully, and we ended up what was a really good trial. It was called the National Network Silvopasture Experiment, and it's from it sort of spawned the UK Agroforestry Forum as well. This site at Loughall is the only one remaining of those 6 sites, and it's pretty well intact in that we still have 3 treatments here, and we still have 3 replicates of each treatment. So the science still continues on it, and the lessons we've learned from it are credible, and they're well backed up by, in the early years, our interaction with those other sites, and now with what we've actually got on the ground here. So what did we plant and what did we do? Our aim, we came to this idea of agroforestry very much as grassland scientists. None of us were really foresters. Truth to be told, in those early days, foresters weren't really interested in agroforestry as a way of growing trees. You know, the proper way to grow trees, they thought, is keep them close together, they'll go up straight, and so on. So this idea of wide-spaced trees, and livestock were an anathema to many foresters anyway. So we really were coming at this from a grassland and agricultural point of view. We wanted to get a system that we could, if you like, bolt on to a lot of our grassland, which was unsustainable through intensification, through removal of hedges, through pollution, through lack of biodiversity, all those things that were sort of afflicting intensive grassland farming. And we wanted to get a system that we could improve, we could deliver these extra range of benefits by having trees into grassland. So we set up the trial with 3 different treatments. We had to obviously compare the controls, and the controls are, this is one of the control plots, which is simply grass only. We had to compare that with just trees only, which is a plot back there, and with in between, which was our agroforestry treatments. So we had those 3 systems set up in replicate plots. Plots are about 1 hectare each, and within those, we used the same species across every site in the UK, and that was sycamore, because it was the one tree that would grow everywhere. But at the end of the day, I think we had bad stock of sycamore, and the sycamore plots never really did terribly well. That's not to say it doesn't do well in an agroforest situation, it does, but there are other issues around with it. So we also planted ash, because at each of the sites we took, if you like, a typical iconic tree that was suited to the local environment. And obviously in Ireland, ash is one of our iconic hardwood trees. It had a great market. It had, we knew it grew well, and all those sorts of things. You know, we weren't to know what was to happen with ash in the long run, but I don't lose too much sleep over that, because we've learnt, in terms of the fact that we've learnt the lessons of agroforestry. I am very worried about what's happening to ash and what's going to come out the far end of that. So we set up, so what we've left now are 3 treatments of that original trial. That is the control, the woodland control, and ash agroforestry, ash silvopasture. So what we're going to do is really just take you through a walkthrough back through those trees again, see how they've changed in 24 years, and from the scene behind me you can see right away they have grown well and have taken off well. And also I can assure you that as a grassland management system, we've been able to manage the grassland within that. The farmer who runs the site, or the farm manager here at Loughall, has been able to manage the grass within that. And I think we've demonstrated at least that we have produced a system which is totally unique in that it's grassland based, but it's delivering a huge range of ecosystem services. In those early days when we started, our priorities were not carbon or reducing ammonia emissions or flood mitigation measures and things like that. You know, they were much more farm oriented and livestock based. Now, of course, in the last 5-6 years, our priorities for what we need farmland to deliver in terms of ecosystem services have really come full swing. And now things like carbon, how can we store more carbon in our grassland? How can we create more biodiversity? How can we have systems that are just more sustainable and more climate resilient? And really, the evidence we have over the 30 years from the agroforestry has enabled us to show that this system will deliver all those objectives. And we have the documentary evidence, if you like, from the fact that it's on a trial, a research farm, to back that up.
It actually looks completely different internally than I expected, because on the outside it looks like it's a closed canopy, but inside there's loads of grass here and very substantial trees. Now, the first thing I notice is, what was the original space in here?
Trees were originally planted at 400 trees per hectare. That is 5 metres between trees on the square. And that is filtered through, that is now the recommendation that's used for all schemes. I mean, some of the early research that we did, and other colleagues did, showed that where they looked at 100 trees per hectare, 200, 400, 600, 400 per hectare, we concluded was a good starting spacing. So that's what we've opted for and what we recommend.
But you're not at 400 here,
No.
I see.
No, and that leads me into really the story of the grass and why we have the density we have. We found, first of all, as I to go back to the start, that we were trying to sell this as a grassland system. So the farmer was able to manage these trees perfectly well. He could sow fertilizer, he could top them, he could cut weeds, he could even spread slurry if he wanted. All that worked, so that was a good thing. So as time went on, over the early years of the trial, we were doing a lot of measurements on grass growth, on tree growth, on livestock performance, and a lot of biodiversity stuff through our links with Queen's University. And then when we got to all the computer models predicted that by about year 6, 7 or 8, you would start to get the canopy closing and grass growth starting to go down. In other words, livestock production starting to fall. We didn't find that. We found that it was year 12 before we started to get any reduction in livestock output from these plots. In other words, comparing this one with the one we've just walked through where there was no trees. So this was a new finding, that grass was much more tolerant of shade and that livestock were getting additional benefits from this synergy with the trees. So livestock production was maintained till about year 12. Then we had to make a decision, right? Do we let the trees continue to grow? Do we let the canopy continue to develop and grass growth continue to fall? Or do we thin out some of the trees, let some light in, let the grass pick up again and keep the system ticking over at a level, you know, which is giving us decent grass production? When it comes to sort of trying to interest farmers in this system and putting, and in those days when we brought farmers to the plots after the 1997 film really, which was more just about getting the trees established, the trees were still fairly small. In subsequent years, by about 2000, 2001, 2003, and when we brought farmers to these plots, and we told them about our decision, we were going to thin the trees after year 12 or 13, one of the things that nearly every farmer said was, this is what we like about this system, is flexibility. Because if we plant a field completely in trees, in dense trees, that's it, we're there for 50 years until we harvest that crop or whatever. Whereas with this silvopasture, we've run two systems side by side, if you like. We have trees growing, but we've got a farming, a grassland system. And it's flexible because we can make a decision at year 12. We can look ahead and say, right, it looks like timber is going to be the big market in the future, or it looks like meat is going to be the big market in the future. We can either decide to let the trees grow on, let the livestock production go down, or vice versa. So in other words, that being able to make those decisions through the flexibility of the system is very, very attractive one to farmers. Yep.
I was going to say, Jim, you know, if you take a woodland and you go into a woodland, is what I found is it's never that easy to get it back into agriculture and pasture because the roots sticking up. So did you have to remove the roots out of here?
Well, okay, we did a thinning then. We took a quarter of the trees out, and we sold them to the Hurley market. We had a meeting of them here. They all came here, and they just went mad about these trees because they had very little experience about growing ash at wide spacing and how it would grow. And there was a problem in the Hurley market then about a lot of the ash that was coming in was continental ash, slow growing, very brittle, very hard, whereas these trees had grown really fast in diameter. And there was a lot of spring in the wood, and the Hurley sticks that were made from it were much better. So the trees had this lovely basal sweep, which meant that you could cut out, you know, you'd maybe cut 8 or dozen trees, 8 trees or whatever it is out of this here. So we sold a quarter of them for about €1,000 per hectare then for Hurley ash. And then about 4 years later we did another thinning. So we're now down to about 200, 210, 220 trees per hectare. What happened with those trees when we took them out? Well, they're gone. We didn't dig the stumps out. We just the Hurley men come and they cut their tree out quite tight into the ground and even low down. Yeah, they cut diagonally down there. So you still are left with a root and stumps and roots in the ground. But because you have your livestock still there, as any resprouts of the ash are just nipped off by the sheep as fast as they grow, or the cattle, and the roots just gradually rot away. And over a couple of years, you just see nothing.
It's amazing. Back to pasture ground.
Now, the point is, in terms of this flexibility, we could decide now, let's say nowadays, you know, carbon's the big story, and everybody, we want to increase tree cover. There's no reason why we couldn't come along and start to interplant again trees in those spacing. So we end up with a mixed age plantation, which is exploiting different layers in the canopy, and it's really, you know, building up a lot of biomass, but still achieving the benefit.
And farming the trees. You could then take this tree out because you have replaced one with...
Yeah, and you might have this tree here then might be here for 50 years, and it will be a really, really valuable tree. As it is, it's pretty good at the minute.
Yeah, like this is commercial quality timber.
Yeah.
Which is something probably we don't necessarily associate with agroforestry.
No, and we should, because, and that's where our early objectives and research were a bit lacking. We didn't highlight enough the timber output you could get from that. And you know, now that agroforestry is starting to take off, and we've got the forestry sector fully, you know, on board, or a lot of them on board with it as a way to grow trees and as a way to grow quality hardwood timber, then I think we'll see a lot more opportunities for silvopasture in that sphere to increase the added value of the system through that.
We're only about 5 days out of potentially a drought here.
Yeah.
And we have you have loads of cover, and we'll go down to where the sheep are grazed now on the other end.
Those have been
And you can just see, but there's no probably loss at all in productivity here.
Well, compared to out there, we're about 75%.
Okay, so there's 25% reduction.
But still, I mean, that's where you've got an accumulating asset.
But what about length of graze? As in, you could graze in here.
You could, surely, yes, and
longer than out there.
Exactly. Well, that's the big seller. One of the big problems we have here in the north, and you have in the south, is ammonia. Ammonia levels given off by livestock systems are just remaining stubbornly high because we've greatly increased the livestock density on this island, and one of the big problems with that is we house animals for sometimes up to half the year, and some big farms now animals are housed year round, and when you mix dung and urine together in slurry, you get ammonia given off, and that ammonia is a real problem. It threatens human health, it threatens biodiversity by dropping nitrogen onto sensitive habitats and all those issues. So ammonia is a big problem in dealing with it. Now, there are various ways of looking at that. I mean, we have research going on in certain areas on ways to try and reduce the ammonia, try to capture the ammonia. But one of those options is if you can increase the length of the grazing season. In other words, if you can keep animals out into a house longer, to stop mixing dung and urine, the ammonia production from animals grazing in a field is only 6% of what it is inside a cattle house. Okay. So it's a nature-based solution, if you like, to help try and reduce ammonia. And we have found in these plots, I measured them a couple of years before I retired, about 2016, 2017, 2018, and we were getting about 12 to 16 weeks extended length of the grazing season, but comparing this plot with that one out there. And if you walk across that plot in the middle of winter, the mud squelching over your feet, and you come in here, it's as dry as a bone. I mean, it just makes that huge difference.
And there's a really interesting statistic somebody was telling me about recently, that is that in beef production at the moment, 50% of the cost of beef production is associated with winter housing.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And if we can reduce that winter... I'm not saying we can do it everywhere, and this is good enough ground, but, you know, there's good evidence that if you have the right tree grow in the right place...
And then you also have the benefit of early grass in the spring.
And you have early grass in the spring, and we're increasingly see, unfortunately I haven't measured it that much detail, is resilience to drought. I mean, during the big drought we had of 2017, August 2017, July, August, when grass growth in Ireland just stopped completely, people said to me, what's happening in your agroforestry plots? Are they not even worse? It was the opposite. I mean, these plots here were quite green still in August 17, and the reason, I'm pretty sure, was the reduced evapotranspiration in the trees. The trees were cutting down. Evapotranspiration takes water out of the soil up through the plants, and if you have, number one, you have a better rooting depth where you have the trees increasing the friability of the soil, and then number two, you're cutting down the wind movement across that pasture. So, you know, it's, in terms of climate resilience, it's ticking a lot of boxes there. Another good point, I mean, we started off with sheep grazing systems because it's much easier to protect a tree against sheep than it is against cattle. We did put cattle in here after about year 6 or year 7. The trees were big enough for young dairy stock, young Frisian heifers we put in there, and the trees stood up to them okay. The problem with sheep is they nibble the bark around the trees, and the problem with cattle is that they rub the trees. So the trees need to be strong enough to put up with cattle. But if you've got some of these modern, sort of more rigid metal type guards, then which are reusable, then you can protect against cattle. In terms of the grassland management, because all our early trials were based on set stocking, because we wanted to measure every output in detail. So let's say in this plot here we would have had 5 ewes and their lambs, plus whatever other sheep were needed to keep the grass at a constant height. That was our measure of grazing density. Intensity was sward height. How much grass have you available? And you take and put animals to keep that a constant. That way we could compare them across all of the sites. And we have a core group of, I think it was 5 ewes with their lambs, and we could follow them right through, so we knew everything about their meat, what was the meat like to come out, what was their wool like, how did their lambs grow, what was the lambing percentage, what was the output. And we found no difference in any situation between the animals out in the open and the animals under the trees. The animals under the trees we think benefited physiologically, psychologically. Who knows what's a happy sheep, but certainly in times of extreme weather stress, you'd always get animals lying under those trees to shelter from the sun or the rain or the heavy wind. So there is that animal welfare benefit to a system like this, which gives them more diversity. But to come back to that set stocking system, as the summer would go on, we would find the sheep would put more and more pressure on the trees and more desire to nibble bark and rub against trees and stuff. So we sort of, after we had finished the series of trials on set stocking, we started to look at rotational grazing, where you let the grass grow up fairly quickly, put the animals, a large number of animals in, let them graze it down, and then get them out again. And we found you got next to no interaction with the tree then. So it was a way you could manage your grazing system to do
Almost they were either bored or there was a deficiency issue.
I think it's
boredom.
2 things.
Yeah,
more
I see
sort of boredom and interaction. The other thing too that, you know, we now have some farmers who are practicing agroforestry, and what they're doing is actually taking a couple of rows of silage, big bale silage, up the middle of the trees, planting them at slightly wider rows. These are 5 by 5, these rows. You could, for example, do 8 by 3, which would 8 metres between the tree rows, which would allow you to comfortably cut a couple of cuts of silage and then just graze your animals. Keep the late grazing for you know, to keep animals out of the houses and let them graze in the autumn. But take a couple of cuts, and that's perfectly possible. And that's if you look at the oldest running trial in the south is Liam Beechener's down in Clonakilty, and he's successfully cut big bale silage between his ash trees, and then he runs the sheep in afterwards to graze them. And as the trees get a bit older, sheep or cattle. So it's an adaptable system.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think you're not going to get every farm to put all their land in agroforestry. That'd be naive to think that. But if farms even had a couple of hectares of or a percentage of their farm in agroforestry, they'd be delivering a whole range of the ecological benefits, and they could save those few hectares of agroforestry for to extend the length of their grazing season. Use them at key times in the year, in the spring and in the autumn, to extend your grazing platform.
Okay, so here we are, Jim, in the grazing area.
Now, this plot we are in has been subdivided, the big plot, the original plot, for the more modern research that's going on, which is great to see. This is one of the drawbacks, if you like, of a research trial. Everything has to be the same and uniform. All these trees are perfectly lined north-south and east-west and stuff. And that's because you're really doing research and you have to be able to measure what you're actually trying to manage. But in real life, I mean, if I was taking the lessons from this out, I would say, you don't have to plant the one species. As Sean says, plant a mixture. You'll get more resilience to all sorts in terms of what's going on under the ground, which is very important, what's going on above the ground. And with a mixture of trees, you will get that difference in canopy that will give you even more diversity. And also, you don't have to plant trees in straight rows and squares. For example, you could contour plant around a hill where you followed more the contours of the land and still kept your spacing. You could just almost random plant if that's what you wanted to do.
Besides the hills or whatever else.
Exactly. And up here really is another way just to introduce silvopasture or trees into the landscape. And in the UK there was a good interest in silvo-arable systems. And we don't have much arable land in the north, or tillage land, nor do you. But there was an interest in England particularly of growing wide-spaced trees in arable crops for lots of different reasons, for landscape reasons, for climate reasons, to cut the wind down of the crop, and because in your under tree layer you could put things like clovers and so on, which would encourage ladybirds, which would reduce aphid infestation, which meant that you could reduce agrochemical use. So we decided we'd put a hectare of agroforestry or of silvo-arable in. Now on this station at Loughall, we had a big interest in biomass and renewable energy trees, and willow and poplar were the basis of that. So we had a poplar collection, and we picked, my colleague Malcolm Dawson picked 4 varieties of poplar that he thought would do well, particularly interested in their resistance to rust, because poplar get very badly hit by rust. And so we put 4 in, and they're at spacings where we could look at the trees, different varieties are opposite each other and so on. And we sowed barley in here. So from 1996, we had 6 years of barley crop, where we had we ploughed each year, we put in a spring barley crop, and we harvested that crop. And over that 6 years, we found no real reduction in yield of the barley. We had an area without trees, top and bottom, so we were able to roughly compare how the effect of the trees on the barley crop. And we got no reduction in barley yield by having the trees there. So it showed that it could work. Those are 12 metres, they're 14 metres apart. That left us 12-metre combinable crop, which is sort of one boom width from a big sprayer, and so you could manage it as a barley crop. After the 6th year, 6 years is long enough to have cereal in the one ground, and also there was an interest amongst some of my grass breeding colleagues in maybe sowing different grass varieties under shade. So we for the final year we put grass in, and it was used then as a silvopasture, because by that time the trees were big enough that you didn't have to do any protection, and we could introduce stock right away. And that's another. I mean, we talk about flexibility of systems. There's no need to be totally rigid in whether you start off planting a silvo-arable or silvopasture. Here you've got a silvo-arable that was converted to silvopasture, and one just merged into the other. It was no big deal, and just simply just a way to get trees into the landscape. And we still have grass under those trees, and it's grown well. The poplar are now 25-year-old. They really are harvestable stage now, and they could be harvested. You would have issues then with stumps and with all sorts of things, but if you're in a permanent silvo-arable system, you could interplant and work around that. But it just showed, I think the lesson it showed mostly, that there were farmers who would be interested in establishing silvopasture and wanted to do that without the hassle of tree protection, and had the land quality to have that flexibility of system. One of the things we're worried about was, would the tree roots interfere severely with the crop, or how would ploughing affect the trees at the end of the day? But we found no negative effects, and when we did a couple of wee profiles looking at the roots under the ground, we found that the roots just really went like that. In other words, what the plough was doing was just root pruning. And if you prune the roots of trees, they grow more vigorously. Just like if you prune shoots of trees, they'll sprout. So we were actually probably stimulating tree growth, but we were still allowing a good barley crop to grow under that at the end of the day. Okay, what we have in here is an interesting trial. This trial was set up as part of his PhD by Dr Rory Lunny, who is still actively involved in agroforestry. Now, what Rory was testing here was under an EU-funded programme called AgroCop, which was agroforestry and coppice, where we were trying to maximise the amount of biomass you got above ground biomass from trees and timber. So between each of these rows of cherry here, there were rows of willow, coppice willow, different varieties and so on, that were coppiced on a 3-year rotation. And but then there was a space and there was a row of cherry. The idea was they would be left to form trees and grow up as the coppice was coppiced, as the willow was coppiced as the understory, if you like. So it was an agroforestry, really, because it was two different systems. And Rory looked at sort of 2 rotations of that, and he got a lot of valuable information on the type of variety you should choose for it, and how, you know, how the coppice willow affected the cherry themselves. And you know, that was a valuable program. The program came to an end though, so AFB decided to remove the coppice willow because, you know, they'd be difficult to manage and they weren't really part of any trial. But that left us with a good opportunity to grass this down and convert this, if you like, into a straight silvopastoral system. So we now have here wide space cherry, selected varieties, good varieties from the clonal trial, which I'll mention in a minute just there, and we have that grass down in between. And these are at about, I think it's about 11 metres by 2 metres between trees. So you can see yourself, you could cut a couple of rows of silage down between those, and then the trees are almost at the state now where you could quite easily put in sheep and graze them. So cherry is a tree that's got tremendous potential. Good straight growth, it's a valuable timber, grows well, it doesn't seem to get many diseases, and you know, we have great hope for it in the future. And in sites where previously we'd have recommended ash, cherry's one of the trees that we would now recommend in silvopasture like this.
And it's quite interesting, it grows very straight.
Yeah.
And you're going to be a long time before you're going to have canopy cover here, Jim, that's going to restrict grass.
Yeah.
So for farmers thinking, this could be an opportunity to do something like this.
It could, surely, and from a forester's point of view, you could think of, in, I don't know, many years, but removing alternate trees here, and you're going to be left with a really good final crop of cherry in an agroforestry scenario.
Great, and they look fantastic, don't they?
Really good trees, a nice, like you say, an open system, and the roots from those trees will be coming in, and you'll be getting the ecological interaction benefits that you get. We planted these with a nurse crop of ash around each tree. They're planted at 3 metres apart with 1.5. There was an ash tree around each tree. These ash, and the ash were there to, if you like, push the cherry up as a nurse tree. So this was not an agroforestry trial. It was very much a tree genetics trial at the end of the day. The ash then subsequently got dieback, and a lot of these did get dieback. The younger trees were badly hit, and we were thinking ahead of the future for this site because I think the other 2 sites didn't really work out very well or whatever. So what we decided to do was remove all the ash trees round about, let the cherry continue to grow, and let this grass up, and then we're going to, if you like, convert this to silvopasture. So pretty soon now we'll be able to put livestock in here to start grazing this. The trees are big enough to not need much in the way of protection if you graze them at a pretty good rate. And you can see yourself, tremendous, some of these cherry for 6 or 7 years are really terrific form. Now, the reason there's some spindly ones because there's 29 different types of cherry been tested here, and there's only half a dozen of them are going to be really suitable at the end of the day, and that's the reason you have trials like that. So you can see that there's some of those they've been pruned twice, and they have got a nice balance of the canopy with the full length of the tree, and they're going to grow into good, very valuable timber. And we'll probably remove every other tree in a few years' time, and that will leave us really with a final crop of sort of 6 metre by 6 metre spaced cherry with pasture below, and that will be a really nice silvopastoral system.
And it's an interesting one because this was not ever envisaged as agroforestry.
Never envisaged, and that's another way you can convert a conventional woodland to agroforestry. In fact, I mean, I have a thought that we have a lot of ash plantations in Ireland that were planted the last 5-10 years that are sadly going to fail and gradually go. And why do we not think of respacing these, thinning them out, and get animals into them so that we gradually convert them into
and maybe leave
silvopasture.
some of the small percentage of the ash survive.
Hopefully some of the ash will survive. Hopefully having the animals in will actually help preserve the length of time before the trees actually get severe dieback, and also then start to interplant with other species. Cherry
is an option,
you know, a range of species, oak, cherry, depending on your site, alder, birch, all those do well in silvopasture.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim, thanks again. It's been absolutely
Not
brilliant.
at all. It's great to have everyone here again.
Yeah. Well, in the next 30 years, we'll look forward to another one.
We'll have another date then. Thank you.
Thanks again, and thanks to everybody.
Thank you.
No wonder, Sean, you were excited about having Dr. Jim McAdam here. That's some story. That's a lifetime's work. Well, we all hear about silvopasture and we hear about the wonder of agroforestry, but until you see that, until you see what happens over 30 years, you don't get a full sense of it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, look, as someone who's been a scientist for 40 years in my career, it shows the benefits of science now. What we hear, we've heard lots of great stories, anecdotal and just obvious evidence. For example, someone says it's quite clear that the soil is healthy where you have white-spaced trees planted. It's quite clear you get more fungi, you get more earthworms. But until you actually just do that and prove it in a replicated trial and measure everything and measure all our variables, and then you're able to stand by that result no matter and say, yes, that observation is absolutely correct. It's backed up by the science. And that's, to me, one of the good things that's come out of, that's only one site, it's using one species, it's on one soil type. But what we've learned today from the other talks is there's huge variation when people put their mind to use this system in a wide range of ways.
I'll hand over to Sean and John, but just briefly, I thought the key thing, I planted 2 hectares in 20 years ago, but I thought the density had to be there for them to grow straight, but you're talking 5 metres apart and somehow they're still growing straight.
Yeah, and we could have done far better if we'd have pruned them properly. Just we had no foresters in our group of scientists in those days. Not one forester was interested at all in silvopasture. And we were just mad grass people. We weren't interested in getting stock and getting more sustainable grassland. So the trees were a bit neglected. And we did slowly realise that these trees are doing quite well now. And we did some pruning. But you could have pruned as those cherry that my colleague... By the way, the site now is still there. It's still protected. It's the oldest running silvopastoral trial in Europe, I believe. It's still intact. And my colleague, Dr. Rodrigo Olave in AFBI, because I have retired, has got funding now for 3 or 4 different projects, EU-funded projects, looking particularly at what's happening below the ground, because that's the real interest of what's happening below that site, and it ties in very much with what Christine was talking about yesterday, and what's happening with the ammonia story. You know, animals under that, putting slurry under those trees, the ammonia has been absorbed by the leaves. We want to prove that and we want to document, and that's the sort of work that the AFBI happily are continuing to use the site for.
Yeah, you know, and there's a couple of things in that video that probably, one was the timber thing. When I was going up, I assumed it was going to be trees, gnarly, not as much grass under them, particularly at 30 years old, and that blew me away. But there was a few other things that was really interesting as well. It's a microclimate in there. It's a completely different thing. And I joke with Jim now and again with this idea about forest bathing, because it's a new concept. But you can actually see why it would work. It wasn't the nicest day. We had coats on, it was freezing, but it was actually lovely inside that wood. And another thing that we didn't talk about on the video there is, but there is a clip where you're looking at the trees that with decent girth on them, straight, and there's a wood that was planted, a normal standard wood, 1 metre, 1 by 1 was spacing.
2 by 2, yeah.
2 by 2 spacing. The other side of the fence, they are completely different size. And you're thinking to yourself, is this not something that we've actually missed now? That we can actually have forest quality trees in that, and you can still farm between them. Like, it is a no-brainer, and we have to take the complications out of this, because, you know, and I know the department have concerns that maybe farmers would cut down trees, but if it can reduce your winter housing, if it can still maintain grass and give you another potential income, it's an absolute no-brainer, and we need to allow these things to happen.
Yeah, just one thing that struck me there, Jim, as I looked at it, we all know that ash are very shallow rooting, you know, so would there have been a different result, do you think, if you'd had a more deep rooting tree? And also as well, you would have been limited maybe more so with ash when it would come to tillage operations and so on because of their nature, would you?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we found, as the trial gradually progressed, and this advantage of extension of the grazing season became obvious, about 2017 or so, or 2018, we did a profile, we looked at the permeability of the soil right down through, and we found a significant difference in soil porosity, the ability of the soil to take up water that's going to come from flash floods, it's going to come from heavy rainfall, down as far as 76 centimetres below the ground. So those ash roots were having a clear effect on the soil, letting the water get through to that depth. Now, I wouldn't advocate planting just a single species of anything. I would say if you had a mixture of trees with different rooting characteristics, different rooting depth, you're going to get the benefits of exploiting the whole soil profile. And in terms of the carbon storage, I mean, one of the really interesting talks yesterday was that the deeper the carbon is stored in the soil from plants, the more recalcitrant it is and the less likely it is to be lost. So that's one of the reasons, and we've looked at soil carbon in that profile, my colleagues in API, and found that the carbon is bound much more tightly in the lower layers in tinier soil particles, and that makes it much more resilient. So yes, ash, it's not as shallow though maybe at that wide spacing as in that soil type, but use a mixture of trees, I think, is your advantage.
Niamh Garvey asks, from a policy perspective, how can silvopasture and agroforestry be better supported?
Yeah, that's the real challenge, Moncon. In the north, silvopasture is supported as an agricultural scheme. It's part of our environmental farming scheme. Moderate uptake, I think it's gradually picking up. In the south, as we know, the issue is it's a forestry measure, and that is, was a stumbling block to some people. I think we really need a vision ahead where we look at it as a completely different system, and we support farmers and growers under both measures. In other words, it could be supported purely as a farming system, because to me it's still a grassland system with trees, yet to somebody in Daphne it's really a forestry system which you just put animals in below. So, but why not allow for both? It's not one or the other, it's something that crosses all the boundaries, and I think it just takes a bit of novel thinking to build it into a new system.
I think just looking at it from an advisory point of view, the last GLOS scheme, we were all encouraged to plant a grove of native trees, and of course I have a grove of native trees all in the corner of a field, so it's always a situation that the mindset is keep the trees here and the farming here, that they're somehow completely separate, and and farmers have grown to believe that forestry is separate, that there can't be sort of this idea of the integration of timber through, which of course is very common in Austria and in many parts of the world. But not here, unfortunately.
Only because we were told not to. The farmers wanted to, it could be argued, but it was absolutely forbidden. There was those few who went against the rules and still got RDS forestry awards despite having animals, but it just wasn't allowed. There's a question from John G. The climate-related pests and disease issues are becoming predicted for tree species now and for plantations. Is this a cause of worry for you?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's one of the reasons. Look, the classic case is we planted ash there. They're probably all going to die at some stage, or 95% of them. It's the old ecological rule, diversity equals stability. Plant, have a multi-species sward, have a multi-species of trees to get resilience, and that resilience will be to different fungi and diseases and stuff like that. It's the basic message, really.
Again, Dara McKiernan says that the land that you planted looked like good quality land. Would that type of silvopasture work well on wetter land, do you think? Yeah,
one of the golden rules about trees is you plant a tree to match your site, there's no, and we would really like to see the expansion of silvopasture on a lot of that marginal land that we have. Okay, we've got to try and get trees integrated into some of the better dairy and beef farms, and that's what really we're putting our mind to a lot. But there's a huge swath. You know, we estimate in Northern Ireland we have maybe 300,000-400,000 hectares of marginal land, which is fairly heavy, it's fairly wet, and if you had, you know, birch, willow, alder trees that would grow on that type of land, agroforestry could really help those, could help improve the utilisation of grass. It can help dry and open up the soil, impermeability of the soil, and it could help flood protection if they were in valleys and all these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Paul Long asked, is there an issue with agroforestry disqualifying you from other schemes, such as the organic farming scheme?
That would be not in the north, but maybe
in the south, yeah, because it becomes non-agricultural land. It becomes forestry land, and then you cannot get any more payments after that. So and it's a pity because there's actually an attractive instalment program, but it's only got a 5-year life then, and then you're out of it. So we're hoping, and you know, because of this issue, there's a few of us have sat down, and we have Chagas involved, we have forestry sector, Jim is involved, some of the Clive Brighton, a few others involved in the Irish Agroforestry Forum. And we're trying to make waves. We ran a first conference last year. We've done a series of farm walks. We'll have more digital outputs now later on in the year. But I suppose we have a policy document, and irishagroforestry.ie is the website, and it's only up and running. We're actually holding Thursday. We're holding an interview for the first employee for that to get the ball rolling, to build up a membership database. The whole idea of that is to promote agroforestry and
irishagroforestry.ie. Very good.
It's the Irish Agroforestry Forum. It's really grown out of the interest over the last couple of years that there's been, and in agroforestry, and the realisation that, you know, people are crying out for information, for pulling their experiences and their knowledge, because this really has a future, we feel, and this organisation will just help act as a conduit for promotion and pulling that together and promoting research, promoting not just research, but nothing beats really practical experience and people sharing their experiences, like we've heard today, Clive and Cahill and people like that. You know, that's what gives you, you know, the real helps a system like that spread out.
Yeah, and it's terrible to think that there's just a bureaucratic issue that's there. Like, we would have intensive tillage farmers and dairy farmers ringing us and saying, is there any way around this? Is this land classification issue a real problem? Because they all see the benefit now of trees. So we have to move on with that one, you know. And we're hoping the new CAP will see that through.
Well, I think that's the big concern is there's already discussion of planting trees as an eco scheme, one of the 4 eco schemes in Pillar 1. It's not even clear as to will that be done along agroforestry lines. We're now talking about, and tomorrow I have a meeting on rare breeds with the department in the morning, talking about the new Agricultural Environment Climate Measure, or ECM. And in that, there will be possibly some tree planting as well, but we still don't know if there's going to be any agroforestry component in that, or is agroforestry going to be something completely separate. So there are an awful lot of unknowns at this stage, and we're getting closer to 2023 and getting closer to, you know, when we should actually know what's coming in Pillar 2 of CAP.
But we've waited so long, I think a couple more weeks.
I'd love to see if there's questions from the audience, and I don't even need a microphone, but as you're thinking of them, Derek Beckett was saying, like, for me that was the first time that I see an alternative to ash, to see the cherry. Derek Beckett is saying, are you finding cherry varieties that are best suited for Ireland? Yeah,
that trial which run on the Office of Future Trees in Chagas, my colleague Dr Rodrigo Olave has been looking at form of cherry. We use 29 different clones of cherry, of wild cherry Pruning, so it's the native cherry town, and within those there's tremendous varieties. Some of them are terrific, and you know, there's half a dozen of them really are tall, straight, growing fast.
Do they not put up a lot of suckers? No, the way
not very much really, but that's for the silvopasture. Yeah, if you have animals in, you'll control that. Animals benefit a lot from eating twigs and leaves of trees. It's been the reduction in methane output from animals eating small twigs, and the health value of likes of willow foliage and so on are very well documented scientifically now. So, an added benefit from having animals in silvopasture.
Questions? Yeah.
A quick one, Jim. Have you noticed if the sheep the bark on the cherry is as susceptible to browsing as the ash?
Well, we haven't actually had the cherries. We haven't had the sheep in the cherries yet. They're just ready to go in. But one of the things I think I made the point about grassland management is one way you can reduce, I think, the interaction of sheep with trees. We only found when we put the sheep in with the trees, it was after a few months that they started to turn to interact more with the trees and nibble the grazing. They got familiar or bored or whatever. Whereas if you had a paddock rotational grazing system, which most farmers operate nowadays, we found next to no interaction or damage with trees. Moving them on, let them a reasonable number of animals in, graze the grass down fairly quickly, and then move them on to the next pasture. And we've seen from a holistic grazing perspective, I mean, that can fit in with your calculation on feed budgeting and moving ahead.
Stephanie Gurin, yes, I'm mispronouncing her surname, asked 3 questions. I think you might have answered the first 2 in your piece, but not the third. What age were the trees when they were planted out? Well, no, you didn't. I suppose roughly a year and a half.
Yeah, 2-year-old saplings. They were small.
Did you winter the sheep inside during this trial? You did for a little bit, did you?
Yeah, we took them on. They were put on just after lambing, usually in March through to November. But as the plots developed, we were finding that on the silvopasture you could keep them out longer and longer because of the effect that the root system was having.
You said 12 to 16 weeks?
That's of the last 3 years. We measured them in the winter of 16, 17, 17, 18, and I've looked at... What we measured was soil moisture content, and we said that after soil moisture content gets above 40%, you're going to get poaching damage. So we looked at the length of time that the soil moisture content remained below 40%, and in the silvopasture, over those 3 years, on average, it was 14 to 15 weeks longer under silvopasture than under grass in a replicated plot situation.
That's extraordinary, particularly with Jack Nolan sort of admitting that or suggesting that our Origin Green certificate might be threatened by the fact that we are having them indoors for so long.
Yeah.
Have to be done. And the third question is of interest to me that Stephanie put: would this system also be suitable for foraging for woodland pigs?
Yes, so we know of some. We have evidence there. Brenton, you have pigs and trees. There's a couple of people in the north. And for poultry, poultry are woodland hens or woodland bird. That's why I'm always this idea of sort of pigeonholing agroforestry into one particular idea of rows of trees and animals or whatever. It's a way of growing, novel way of getting trees into just farming systems, into horticultural systems, into fruit production systems, into poultry, to turkeys, to pigs, to sheep. All of those trees can be integrated into those. And at the end of the day, the bottom line is soil health is improved, and with the good evidence for all of that.
Yeah. Was there one other question, Jim? Do you know I'll ask that because Jim, you don't talk behind you. Yes.
Hi. Fascinating discussion. I'm interested in existing forestry. So what you can do is pilot studies on agricultural land being forested.
Very, very good point. I mean, you can establish a silvopasture 2 ways. You can either go from scratch, take a green field and plant trees in and protect them, or you can respace an existing forest where you can remove some trees, and that's why you can remove trees, you can oversow grass, run animals over to tramp the seed in, and you can establish a sward or a mixed species sward perfectly well. And as we said, one of the things we'd like to try, and Chagas are going to try at Johnstown Castle is take a mixed ash oak plantation, which is which the ash are failing in, and use that as a way of removing some of the trees, converting it into silvopasture, and then maybe interplanting new trees as you go on. So yes, an open mind to take a forest. And I saw a lovely site in Wales where they had a larch plantation, which was about 15 years old. They thinned out every third row they took out. They took 2 rows out of every 3, so they were left with a wide split open. They oversowed grass and clover, ran sheep over it. It was in a fairly heavy, clay peat soil, and now you have larch is a good tree for that because it's it gives you a length of extended grazing season, and now you have a lovely silvopasture system with sheep under larch, established, if you like, by respacing the initial forestry.
It should be noted that only do this when your premium is covered, because it's against the rules on the forestry system to do that. But there is a couple of good examples of people that have done that now starting to pop up in Ireland as well. And it becomes the natural shed.
I'm going to get 2 more questions from the audience, from Jim Cronin and from Cahill, and then we might do our debrief. Jim.
So my question was, what fertility did you apply underneath the various trial plots?
Fertility?
Yeah.
We used just straight nitrogen application. It wasn't an organic trial, it was a conventional grassland trial. We used a maximum of 90 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare on that, on both sites, and we measured very carefully the nutrient levels in the foliage of the ash, and we got no luxury uptake of fertilizer. Because one of the things we're trying to prove is that in silvopasture, if you've got that network of roots below the ground, if you have any excess nutrients, whether it's from slurry or whether it's from a bag fertilizer applied, that the tree roots will get that, particularly the phosphate, out of the ground and back into the trees before it gets into the water course. But silvopasture, as we've seen here, perfectly adapted to an organic system.
And Jim, would you say there's an awful lot more work to be done around those mycorrhizal pathways and the way that trees communicate and all of that new science that's coming out now?
New science has come in, and ideal. I mean, how do these trees' roots interact below the ground, communicate below the ground, move nutrients between themselves below the ground?
And just let people know, tomorrow we're starting a little bit earlier because we have Christine Jones back on. I must remind everybody that we missed our presentation yesterday, so you're getting a bonus one tomorrow. I think 1:30, Kevin, 1:30. So don't forget that. And this is her baby.
And the Angels are telling me Cahill Mooney has a brief question. Do you?
Talk about the benefit for the herbivores and the shoots and that. Have you looked into actually utilising some of the fodder and using the foliage to feed, because it would be a much higher nutrients?
Yep. Because we only had the one species there, but our observation was that as soon as the leaves with ash, as soon as the leaves fell in the autumn, the animals just ate them immediately. And you're talking about the early stages of the trials when there wasn't such an interest in methane and so on. But at the Organic Research Centre in England, they've just published, I think they took about a dozen different tree species where they've fed the foliage to livestock, and they've analysed all the foliage for nutrients and fed it to livestock, and they've published really interesting results on the beneficial effects of tree foliage on animal health and growth. And they may have measured methane emissions as well, because that's the one area where you could really hopefully excite policy people in the way that you could make livestock systems more sustainable.
So we're going to take a brief break before we come back for our debrief, our final debrief. But first, I just want to thank Jim McAdam, not only for the talk today, but that 40 years of the work in the Irish Agroforestry Forum and in the Loughall Agroforestry site. Thank you, and thank you for sharing with us.